I want to talk about during this time is kinetic anti-satellite missiles, what they are, who has the capability, some of the benefits and drawbacks that we see of their potential use, but also more broadly, what it means for conflict in space, for military space policy, and look at, I suppose, that bigger context that we see kinetic ASATs as part of. ASATs have been in the news again recently. Russia tested an ASAT missile. While this didn't directly hit a satellite, it was more of a test of the missile capability. It did provoke quite a lot of reaction, particularly from the US. And what you see here are three headlines just pulled off, but that really show how this test was seen by the US, very much around weaponizing space and very dangerous, and going against some of those measures that Russia's been a part of, which I'll come on to, around arms control. Last year, there was a test by India, which did hit one of their own satellites. Perhaps the most infamous test was the 2007 test by China, again against one of their own satellites. And it's that test that is most often brought up when there are discussions about when, we saw the beginning of the weaponization of space and the change from it being a relatively benign domain into one much more associated with warfighting. So on the surface, it might appear that, this is a very new capability, suddenly everyone's developing it, and it's going to lead to conflict in space. But actually, if you dig down a little bit into this detail, we start to understand really much better why they're being developed, how they might be used, and what the implications actually are of this new capability. So the idea of ASATs actually goes back to the beginnings of the usage of space. During the Cold War, the US, the Soviet Union were developing and looking at ways of disabling or destroying each other's satellites to gain advantage, to stop the benefits of space being used. So the narrative that this is new, that this is suddenly changing everything isn't particularly helpful. Yes, more actors do have this capability now, and there's a much different international security environment that is affecting how space is playing and what that security environment means within space. The US narrative very much is, particularly after the end of the Cold War, the US had dominance of space, and it was also a sanctuary, which, as I said, doesn't really take into account what happened before. So their narrative is very much China, Russia, they're weaponizing space, they're putting us at risk, which doesn't, again, take into account the fact that the US has also developed a number of these capabilities. The kinetic ASATs that we see are ground-launched, they're missiles, and they're capable of reaching, at the moment, low Earth orbit. There is evidence that we could see these missiles being developed to reach further, to reach medium or geostationary Earth orbit. And that, again, will perhaps change how they might be used and how people might react to them. We're also, there could be potential for space-based missiles, so a missile that's actually in orbit that could be used. That does have some different implications, so particularly around the placement of weapons in orbit, and again, how that would affect the narratives around weaponization. If we look here at some data around the three different tests, the Chinese test of 2007, last year's Indian test, and also one from the United States. And we can see that they were at different altitudes. And that's really, really important, because a kinetic anti-satellite missile will create a huge amount of debris. I'm sure most of you who are involved in space or who read about space security are aware of the dangers of orbital debris and what this could mean for the sustainability of orbit, for the safety of satellites. The Chinese one at around 800 kilometers created thousands of pieces of debris, which we expect to see lasting decades, perhaps longer in orbit. And of course, the longer they're there, the more potential they have for causing some damage. Now, both the US and Indian tests were at much lower altitudes. So the debris is not going to last as long in orbit. And so in a way, these have been seen as responsible anti-satellite tests, almost normalizing the ability to carry out these tests as long as they can be made out to be a bit more responsible. No one wants to be blowing up satellites, but it's okay because we didn't create as much damage. As I mentioned, the Russian test was just testing the missile. It didn't create any debris, but that's not to say that they wouldn't be looking at carrying out such a test in the future. So, you know, we have to be thinking, why is this capability being developed? And the obvious answer is destroying an adversary satellite. That's it. We want to destroy their satellite. It's an act of aggression. But it's a much, much more complicated scenario. On one side, we have the sense that it's about projecting power. We have this capability. We can destroy a satellite if we want. You know, we're seeing quite a lot of research now going into what does this actually mean for deterrence in space? Are these much more a deterrent rather than something to be used? But if the use against a satellite is the primary reason, again, we have to ask why. It's not necessarily just about destroying a satellite and saying we can do that. Which satellite was it? What capability does that satellite have? What information is that satellite providing? And therefore, what is the impact of the loss of that satellite? So we start to get into these questions about denying space. And you often see people talking about what happens if you can deny space. And it's not necessarily saying it's denying space, it's denying a specific capability. But using an ASAT would be very escalatory. It's moving into that, you know, really crossing a line of aggression, of warfare, I suppose, in space. And obviously there could be huge repercussions, whether that's an ASAT test coming back, whether that's a response in another domain. So the benefits gained from taking out a specific satellite would have to outweigh those repercussions of using it in terms of escalation, in terms of what it means for long-term space security. And there are, of course, other drawbacks. As I mentioned, overt act of aggression, what that means, the debris. Debris affects everyone. You cannot know for certain what's going to happen when you blow up a satellite, when you destroy a satellite. You don't know where that debris will be going. You don't know how it will impact with other pieces of debris, with defunct satellites, with other satellites, and how that could actually cause you more long-term damage down the road and put all space assets at risk. So there is a real question here about whether kinetic anti-satellite missiles like this would actually have any use. And part of this narrative has also been that the development of these anti-satellite missiles is leading to an inevitable space war, that conflict in space is inevitable. But just focusing on that and just focusing on these ASATs, again, doesn't take into account this much bigger context. So we can't really appreciate the full impact of the development of this capability without understanding this much bigger context. Counterspace capabilities is a term that's becoming more normal and more normalized, and what we're using a lot more, rather than, you know, a space weapon which has so many difficult ways of defining. And these, you know, on one side, at one end of the spectrum, you have the kinetic ASAT, but then you have this whole other spectrum of non-kinetic capabilities. GPS jamming, GPS spoofing, the use potentially of lasers to dazzle the optical sensors of a satellite. So you're disabling it, you're denying it for a period of time. Rendezvous and proximity operations, so the ability to approach other satellites, potentially interfere with them. And these activities they're sub-threshold, and there are a lot of difficulties with attribution. And it's actually what we see happening much more frequently. Because it doesn't cross that line. It doesn't create those difficulties that would come with moving into a much more obvious conflict. And of course, we don't just have states and militaries operating in space. We have a much broader commercial space environment, and the commercial sector is moving forward very, very quickly in terms of capabilities. Rendezvous and proximity operations for debris removal, for satellite servicing, numbers of satellites, much faster launch times, small satellites. And that brings in a lot of economic considerations. So when you talk about the security environment in space, it's not just military satellites and the military uses, but so many states have huge economic considerations when thinking about their space activities. And of course, with all of these counter space capabilities, we have that very difficult, very contentious area, which is the international law, the international regulations, particularly around arms control and disarmament. And I mentioned at the beginning that with the US response to the Russian test, they called out Russia's hypocrisy around this, because Russia and China have been leading the discussions at the UN around PAROS, which is the prevention of an arms race in outer space, and the associated prevention of the placement of weapons in orbit treaty. So they're saying, you're trying to push this treaty, but you're also developing these capabilities. And with the lack of international regulation, the difficulties around the legal considerations, all of these new capabilities, it's very difficult for the international community to come to agreements about how to potentially regulate them, what they mean, and what the implications are. These are constantly ongoing, but the way that technology is moving forward so quickly, it's very, very difficult to keep up with what's happening and be able to have regulations that are adaptable. So whilst they're the most obvious, I suppose in a way the sexiest side of space warfare, kinetic anti-satellite missiles are a very, very small part of a much more complex environment, much broader picture. So focusing on them as weaponizing space, as leading to conflict in space is I don't think very helpful. I don't think that's necessarily a way that is going to lead to any kind of agreement or understanding of what we will actually see happening in the future. Conflict in space is a very difficult concept. What do we mean by it? It's just conflict. It's just in a different environment, and it has its own ways of operating and its own risks and threats. But sometimes, again, looking at it as conflict in space or things that are happening in space doesn't necessarily allow for that appreciation of the role that space plays in our lives in the military, and how it's integrated, particularly into other military structures. So we talk about space assets, but should we instead be talking about the space segment of a military communications architecture, the space segment of a military ISR architecture, when thinking about the vulnerabilities and then how we adapt? And looking at any conflict that might happen in space as part of a bigger spectrum, rather than something separate that needs a completely separate way of looking at it. It's not in anyone's interest for a shooting war in space, however you want to define a shooting war. Everyone relies on space. We all do every day. You don't have to be a space actor to be impacted by this escalation in space. And particularly also for the great powers. They all have so much to lose. Yes, there are arguments about, the US may be more vulnerable, more reliant on space than China. Therefore, if there was a shooting war and low Earth orbit, just, we lost the use of it, the US would be worse off than China. And there's all this balance, but it doesn't suit anyone, particularly at the beginning of a conflict. I do think that if we saw the use of kinetic anti-satellite missiles, it would not be first or second strike. We're looking much further down a conflict where it matters less. So maybe their utility is that it's in their non-use. So what does this mean? I suppose looking at policy with the US and then what it means for the UK, we can see how the narrative I've talked about that's coming from the US has affected what we've seen happening over the last couple of years with the establishment of US Space Force and the re-establishment of US Space Command. There's quite a lot of language coming out of the US that takes this narrative further by, I've heard phrases like always the predator, never the prey. They want to be on the front foot when dealing with the potential threats. And that's not to say that there isn't a use for a country like the US that has such a huge military space structure to not have an associated structure that manages that. That makes perfect sense. But you can see how that narrative is informing some of these policy decisions. And there's also questions, I suppose, about the timing of which activities do we see the US perhaps responding to more than others. The Russian test of the Noodle missile, that's potentially happened 8 or 9 times before. So why now? Why have we decided to respond now? But it does affect the US's adoption, I suppose, of saying space is a war-fighting domain. That sense of inevitability, that sense of this is here and this is how we are going to act, and we're going to act offensively perhaps and really almost take on the adversary. So for the UK, there are some really quite important policy questions that the UK military and the space segment within the UK military needs to be thinking about. What kind of military space power do we want to be? Recognizing that we have far fewer sovereign space assets. We rely quite to a very large extent on the US as a partner, particularly through Five Eyes, on US assets, on US intelligence from space. So, but at the same time, we have a responsibility to our own security. We have our partnership with NATO. As part of Europe. So there's a question the UK needs to decide really along. Do we want to go down that route of space is a war-fighting domain, and we will be a part of that, and we will support our allies with potential offensive capabilities, with looking at that way of operating in space? Or do we go down another route, which is saying it's an operational domain? We recognize its importance for the military. We recognize that there are benefits to be had, and it's how we decide to protect, to get more capabilities and to increase our use of space, but without taking that slightly more aggressive tone by not looking at space conflict as inevitable, by not looking necessarily at every action by others as aggressive or adversarial, but that there is a balance that exists right now in space between the major space actors. It's a very fine balance, and of course it could be tipped one way or the other, but it pretty much does allow everyone to do what they need to do without crossing that line, without tipping it into further conflict. I personally am feeling more positive about the way the UK is heading, that we now have a structure in place to be able to make these decisions, because that will very much dictate what military space in the UK is going to look like, in terms of the numbers of people we have, in terms of the capabilities we have, in terms of the partnerships that we have.